a challenge to dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain an individual presentation edited to stand alone. We hope you find them to be of value.
We're going to now move, at least conceptually, to the Middle East, where we're going to learn about the lives of Iraqi women and their reproductive vulnerabilities. Our next speaker is Dr. Marcia Inhorn, and she's the William Landman Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs and Chair of the Council on Middle East Studies at Yale University. And we welcome Dr. Inhorn. Thank you.
There we go. Hello, I'm so happy to be here, though from afar, and I really see so many friends on the Zoom here. I also just have to say, Farhana, that is incredible work that you're doing. It was extremely powerful, your presentation, and just, really impressive, the NGO that you've started with your husband too. So thank you. That was one of the most powerful presentations I've heard in a long time. I'm actually going to be talking about men today more than women.
Recording in progress.
In my talk on America's war and Iraqi refugees' lives. And I want to begin with an argument, namely that America has failed in its moral duty to assist those whose lives it has destroyed through its own wars in the Middle East. Focusing on Iraq, I want to show how America's two wars there have had a shattering effect, not only for Iraqis who remain in the country, but also for those who have fled. In America today, few people connect the current Middle Eastern refugee crisis to the United States military interventions in Iraq. In the US, memories of the Iraq wars have faded, and the Iraqi refugee crisis seems distant. So my main goal today is to rekindle this moribund history of these American wars and to link them directly to Iraqi refugee flight. And as a medical anthropologist, I've always been particularly concerned about the health costs of war in Iraq, not only for Iraqis who remained in the country, but also for those who have fled. And as I hope to show today, the health costs of conflict in Iraq include a toxic legacy literally carried in the bodies of exposed Iraqi refugees. And I want to illuminate the embodied dimensions of this human suffering. Although the US has never been a particularly welcoming home for refugees from the Middle East, Iraqi refugees with such health problems face additional regimes of exclusion. Indeed, I argue that the US has failed in its commitment to the lives of those Iraqis whose country and reproductive bodies it has destroyed. And so this is the main argument of my book, which was published in 2018 by Stanford University Press, called America's Arab Refugees, Vulnerability and Health on the Margins. And it was published, I finished writing it and it was published during the Trump regime. So I feel that it was particularly pertinent at that moment in American history. So throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the Middle East has suffered a disproportionate number of wars and protracted conflicts that have led to population disruption and turmoil. Even before the fateful 2011 Arab uprisings that led to the Syrian government's war against its own people, 15 of 22 Arab League nations, comprising 85% of the region's overall population, had suffered from complex emergencies, including the country of Iraq. Indeed, it's fair to say that Iraq has lived through 40 years of perpetual war and human suffering. Saddam Hussein came to power in 1979 and soon plunged his country into a crippling 8-year war with neighboring Iran. The Iran-Iraq war led to the death of as many as 1 million soldiers and civilians. Then in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded another neighboring country, Kuwait, which led to Operation Desert Storm, the US's first military intervention in that country. Lasting only 7 months, the first Gulf War in Iraq nonetheless led to as many as 120,000 casualties, followed by 13 years of UN-imposed sanctions. In 1996, the United Nations implemented an oil for food program to prevent massive starvation in the country. But the sanctions continued to cripple the Iraqi economy until they were removed at the start of the second US-led war in Iraq. Responding to the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, and driven by a determination to eliminate Middle Eastern terrorism, the United States launched Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. We now know that the war was initiated upon false intelligence, purporting Saddam Hussein's links to September 11th and his threats to U.S. national security through weapons of mass destruction. And I think this is highlighted again with Colin Powell's recent death. In retrospect, the second U.S.-led war in Iraq is widely condemned as a U.S. military and foreign policy failure of massive proportions, perhaps the worst in modern U.S. and Middle Eastern history. The U.S. military intervention in Iraq increased political instability in the country, leading to a power vacuum that was partly filled by Islamic insurgent groups, most notably ISIS. Furthermore, the U.S. invasion of Iraq served as a crucial tipping point in an unstable sectarian balance of power, unleashing deep-seated sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia Muslim factions in the country. And this brings us to the present moment. Although an end to the Iraq War has been declared twice, first by President George W. Bush in his Mission Accomplished speech on May 1st, 2003, and then on December 19th, 2011, 10 years ago, by President Barack Obama, the truth is that the U.S. military presence in Iraq has never ended. In 2016 alone, the U.S. dropped a total of 12,095 bombs on Iraq in its battle against ISIS. At the beginning of 2020, nearly 1,000 additional U.S. troops joined the 5,200 troops already on the ground in Iraq in response to Iraqi protesters who stormed the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. As of today, there are 2,500 U.S. troops in Iraq, although President Biden pledges to withdraw them by the end of the year. And one can only hope that the outcome of that withdrawal will not replicate the chaos of the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Indeed, the inconvenient truth of both Iraq and Afghanistan, but one that few Americans seem to ponder, is that the United States has done more to produce and sustain deadly wars in the Middle East than to relieve them. Now, how has this ceaseless violence impacted the Iraqi people? The costs of war in Iraq have been acute, involving syndemics, or synergistic epidemics of human suffering. In Iraq, war-related syndemics have involved thousands of civilian casualties and countless injuries, destruction of the healthcare infrastructure and flight of medically trained personnel, and physical and mental health problems of those who remain, some of which are due to war-related environmental contamination. And here I want to focus on the toxic legacy of war in Iraq, particularly the use of depleted uranium, or DU, a radioactive toxin that has been linked to a number of adverse health effects, including reproductive impairments. DU was used by U.S. forces in both the First and Second Gulf Wars. It is the waste product of the uranium enrichment process, and it's about 60% more radioactive than natural uranium. Like lead, nickel, and other heavy metals, DU is chemically toxic to humans. But it's been used since 1959 in the US munitions industry because it is 65% denser than lead, it has a high melting point, it has a tensile strength comparable to most steels, and it ignites when it fragments. The US military has called DU the silver bullet for destroying enemy tanks and the silver shield for armoring US tanks against enemy fire. However, when DU explodes, it creates a fine respirable-sized dust that contaminates an impact site and presents a hazard to combat troops and civilians. This DU dust in the environment has a radioactive decay chain lasting 4.5 billion years, thereby posing very long-term health risks to exposed populations. So DU activists began to accuse the US Department of Defense of gross negligence in using a weapon in Iraq that, and I quote, distributes large quantities of toxic waste in areas where people live, work, grow food, or draw water, unquote. The potential dangers of DU emerged as a social, political, and scientific issue after the First Gulf War. It's estimated that nearly 900,000 DU rounds were fired in Iraq by US and British troops in that war, with Gulf War veterans eventually attempting to link DU contamination to so-called Gulf War syndrome, a cluster of health problems, including, among other things, both reproductive and sexual health impairments. In a 10-year follow-up study of American veterans who were hit by friendly fire and thus had DU shrapnel embedded in their bodies, researchers showed that higher than normal levels of uranium were associated with perturbations in reproductive hormones, causing male infertility and erectile dysfunction. Some evidence of neurological and genetic damage was also evident. With the ongoing use of DU in the 2003 Iraqi invasion, the World Health Organization finally released a report titled Potential Impact of Conflict on Health in Iraq, which suggested that DU might be related to reports of increased cancers, birth defects, reproductive health problems, and renal diseases in the Iraqi population. A series of studies later carried out in the heavily bombarded city of Fallujah, which sustained some of the worst damage by US forces, show a syndemic of health-related problems, including high rates of congenital malformations, about 15% of all births, higher than expected rates of cancer, especially blood cancer.
Recording stopped.
Leukemia and lymphoma in children, higher than expected rates of infant death when compared to infant mortality rates across the region, and an anomalous sex ratio in children under age 5, suggesting that genetic damage was sustained
Recording in progress.
in the 0 to age 4 cohort. Hair samples taken from the parents of so-called Fallujah babies, or Iraqi neonates with severe congenital malformations, show the statistically significant presence of DU in their mothers' bodies. Additional studies of DU exposure in Iraq demonstrate the substance's genotoxicity, or ability to cause genetic damage even greater than previously thought. The chemical's carcinogenic or cancer-causing effects have led to an overall increase in breast, lung, thyroid, and blood cancers in Iraq, doubling or even tripling in incidence in some regions of the country. Of importance to US troops, inhalation and internalization of DU into the body has been shown to cause multiple health risks to US veterans, especially those who performed as crews of damaged tanks and rescue teams. Thus, the health costs of DU have affected American soldiers and Iraqi civilians alike. And so the synergism of these health-related effects can be seen in the story of Kamal, an Iraqi refugee I met in a reproductive health clinic in the state of Michigan. As I was to learn from Kamal, he had been conscripted into Saddam's army as a telecommunications specialist. I was always in a tank, he said, and I saw everything, the smells, the dead people. Eventually, Kamal joined the Iraqi resistance and made his way out of the country, but he was concerned about his relatives left behind in Iraq. He explained to me, "We heard that there is uranium everywhere. You know, Marcia, cancer, a lot of people in Iraq got cancer. If you ask anybody here, you got the flu, or now it would be COVID, the question there would be, you got cancer? Before, it was not easy to use the term saratan, which is Arabic for cancer. But now it's easy to say, I got cancer. My sister, she had a 16-year-old daughter. She died after 2 months from cancer, liver cancer. She found out and then she died." By the time I met Kamal in Detroit, Michigan, he had a happy story to tell. In the 10 years since he had arrived in America, Kamal was able to accomplish many of the things in life that other Iraqi refugees could only dream of. These included a happy marriage to his Iraqi sweetheart, whom he had met in a refugee camp, American citizenship by way of naturalization, an economically stable life as the proprietor of 2 small barbershops, ownership of 2 fixer-upper homes that he and his 2 Iraqi refugee brothers had remodeled, and the joys of parenthood through the birth of a baby. Pulling a photo from his wallet, Kamal smiled widely when he showed me the picture of his little Haider, his 13-month-old son. As he pointed out proudly, Haider was an American by birth, not born in exile, in a land that they now called home. However, as Kamal confessed to me, Haider's birth was exceptional because Kamal suffered from a serious male infertility problem that could only be overcome through costly assisted reproductive technologies. Male infertility, he explained, was common in Iraq and among his refugee community in Michigan, a situation that he linked to war-related environmental exposure. And he said, Marcia, I want to tell you something about me. I have no problem with sex, no problem with my body. I don't smoke, no drinking. I do exercise every day and I'm healthy. But I know a lot of Iraqi men like me. They don't have kids and they take a long time to get a baby. I know about 15 to 20 people like that here in Michigan. Some are friends of mine. We are all refugees, all of us Iraqi refugees, the same life we lived, the same war, the same camp, the same thing. And we began talking about the subject of not getting babies. I always tell them, we don't want to be shy about this because we need a baby. Don't be shy. Go to the doctor. Don't stay at home. Tell him, the doctor, I'm sick and I need to take medicine. I know somebody with male infertility and he was ready to make a divorce with his wife and he's young. But I tell him, please don't do that. Go to the doctor. Do something. In Iraq, we lost all our good doctors, but here in America, everything is good. The doctor is good. Technology is good. Medicine is good. But some men, they're embarrassed to say, I have this problem. It's the rujula, the manhood, but this is wrong. As Kamal explained, many Iraqi refugee men feared that their reproductive health problems were somehow due to irremediable war-related exposures and traumas. Not surprisingly, al-Harb, the war, figured prominently in Iraqi refugee men's narratives, given that some men had been combatants while others had suffered torture and imprisonment in their home country. To that end, they felt grateful to have escaped alive, although life in America was not easy, as their stories revealed. And so I collected such narratives of suffering and reproductive disruption over a 5-year period of ethnographic fieldwork with nearly 100 resettled Arab refugees in Dearborn, Michigan, an ethnic enclave community on the margins of Detroit, which is considered to be the capital of Arab America. The arrival of Iraqi refugees to the Detroit area is not surprising, given that Metro Detroit has been one of North America's largest Middle Eastern refugee receiving grounds. Beginning in the 1950s, exiled Palestinians started resettling in the Detroit suburbs, a pattern that continued among Palestinians over the 5 ensuing decades. By the 1970s, Palestinians were joined by Lebanese, whose numbers swelled with each passing year of the Lebanese Civil War. By the mid-1990s, Lebanese and Palestinians were joined by Iraqis, tens of thousands of whom came as refugees in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. Thus, over half a century, metropolitan Detroit absorbed 3 major populations of fleeing Arabs, Palestinians, then Lebanese, then Iraqis. By 2000, Michigan scholars dubbed the city's new ethnic enclave Arab Detroit, highlighting the importance of 250,000 people of Arab descent now living in the area. However, in 2008, the same year as the Great Recession, the Iraqi population of Arab Detroit began to swell as the second wave of refugees began to receive admission into the US. As shown in this table, Iraqi refugee admissions in 2008 increased 8-fold over 2007. By 2009, fully 1/4 of all refugees entering the United States were Iraqis, and Arab Detroit absorbed nearly as many as the cities of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined. By 2014, Iraqis represented 28% of the refugees entering the US, the single largest group. So this table is from 2007 to 2015, 126,000 Iraqi refugees entered the US. This was fully 1/5 of all refugees admitted, but less than 1/2 of the Iraqis seeking US refugee assistance. And as seen in this table, Iraqis were resettled in every single US state except Wyoming, the home of former Vice President Dick Cheney. And if you go to level 1, the states that supported the most Iraqis, you can see your state of California was number 1, particularly El Cajon, which is the Iraqi hub of California, but Michigan was the second most generous state, followed by Texas. Yet, the local Michigan economy is poorly suited for large-scale Iraqi refugee resettlement, particularly the city of Detroit, where most of these refugees were placed. Detroit is America's poorest big city, with 38% of its population, roughly 2/5, living below the federal poverty line. 2/3 of Detroiters live in a state of ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, although employed, basically the working poor. These poverty figures are replicated in Arab Detroit's refugee community. Fully 4/5, or 82%, of all Iraqi Muslim refugee families live on household incomes of less than $30,000 per year, and nearly half, 42%, live well below the US federal poverty line on household incomes of less than $10,000 per year. Astonishingly low. So given these poverty statistics, it's not surprising that most of the Iraqi refugees I met in Arab Detroit were precariously employed and often desperately poor. Many of the men did not speak English fluently, nor did their wives, as few had attended school in the United States and few had gone beyond high school in their home country. Without strong English skills or advanced educations, most of the Iraqi refugee men in my study were employable only in low-wage, blue-collar, or service sector occupations, mainly as gas station attendants, dishwashers and busboys in Middle Eastern restaurants, truck drivers, construction workers, auto mechanics, and occasionally factory workers. But in 2008 and thereafter, the Michigan auto industry took a real dive, and so it was hard to get factory work. Salaries and wages were generally low, with many men and their wives living in small apartments and generally eking out subsistence lives below the poverty line. Now, without regular employment, most did not have private health insurance to cover costs of their medical care. Most did not own credit cards. And as a result, virtually all of their financial transactions, including visits to medical clinics, were handled in cash. In cases of medical emergency, social safety nets were generally missing, forcing some participants in my study to rely on local Islamic charities for relief. And I'm almost done. But I met all of these men and women who were suffering from problems of infertility, with male infertility of the kind faced by Kamal, the most frequent diagnosis. Like Kamal, all of the men and women in my study were dreaming of becoming parents, not only to achieve cultural mandates of adult personhood, but to make new lives and new families after all that had been lost. However, unlike Kamal, few of these men and women could afford the $150 office visit, let alone a $12,000 cycle of in vitro fertilization. And so Kamal was the only person in my study who was able to self-finance 3 costly rounds of this thing, which is called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, a variant of IVF designed specifically to overcome male infertility. Kamal was, at the end of the day, one of only 2 men in my study who were able to father an ICSI or IVF child. So by the end of my study, I came to think of these poor, struggling, infertile refugees as reproductive exiles. Banished from their home country by war, most remained in a kind of double exile, unable to return to Iraq because of ongoing violence and a shattered healthcare system, but unable to access infertility services in the most expensive country in the world in which to make an IVF baby. Living constrained lives on the margins of Detroit, there was little that they could do to change their situations. They were reproductive exiles, impoverished, immobile, and barren, but exiled from a costly American healthcare system in which access to affordable IVF was impossible. So ultimately, I want to again argue that the United States has never been a particularly welcoming home for refugees from the Middle East, and we certainly see this in the plight of infertile Iraqi refugees. Their reproductive bodies have been made toxic from US military intervention, but they are unable to seek recompense and recovery in the US healthcare system. Such regimes of exclusion make crystal clear the lack of US commitment to the lives of Iraqi refugees whose country it has partially destroyed, and we now see their lives of barren reproductive exile as they try to make a living in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very tragic and sobering. We only have time for one question. Is there anyone who's physically here in the room that would like to make a question or a comment? Okay, there is one comment online. I'll just read it. Can you talk about how Kamal's experience with infertility and seeking treatment was similar or different to less well-off Iraqi refugees in Detroit? Those may be less equipped to obtain assistance in their quest to have a child. Also, I'm curious if you have done research with American service members who are experiencing similar difficulties with fertility. That's from Dr. Seth Hanna.
Hi, Dr. Seth Hanna. So nice to see you out there. Yeah, I mean, Kamal, sort of include his story here just because it had all the elements of the infertility, the cancer, the exposure to DU, the fight, being a soldier in Iraq. He sort of brought all those issues to the fore. But as I said, he was unusual. He was really one of 2 people out of everybody that I met that was able to make a baby. And it was a tragic story. I mean, I thank you for that term, tragic. It is an American tragedy, in a way. America caused a tragedy in Iraq, and then, the tragedy of people coming here and not being able to have the children that they really, really, really want. And so most of the rest of the refugees I met were really struggling to pay the office visit. It was cash because they didn't have any other way of paying. IVF in the United States is almost always private. People pay. It's a cost for you have to pay. It's private medicine and it's very expensive. And so very, very few people were able to do those technologies, even though in this particular Arab serving IVF clinic where I worked, there was a doctor who was humane and tried to give people generous discounts, and it still was thousands of dollars, which people couldn't come up with. So, like many underrepresented minority groups in America, we see that there are real reproductive justice and access issues here. And we just honestly still don't have good scholarship in America on the infertility problems of minority populations, including various Middle Eastern and refugee populations in this country. So I would say much more research needs to be done on what the reproductive effects are. Nobody that I know of has done any kind of ethnographic work on the reproductive health problems of American US service people, but there is an excellent book about UK Gulf War veterans by an anthropologist in the UK, and the book is entitled Impotent Warriors. It's called Impotent Warriors, and it's about men with Gulf War syndrome, UK British soldiers who are suffering from sexual and reproductive health problems. And so, yes, that's the one thing I can point you to. There's also, as you may know, Erin Finley, another a medical anthropologist, did a very profound ethnography of American soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan with PTSD and mental health issues. So there's been some work on.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we need to move on.